Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a learning and growing webinar, Understanding Intersectionality, creating a holistic approach to inclusive teaching. Our presenter today is Chana Engoff of Adelphi University. My name is Sidra, and I'll be your moderator for today for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions you have into the Q&A as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you everyone for joining us in the summertime. I know that it's normally academic time off, which really means time for research, I think, for the most part. So I appreciate you coming and wanting to delve deeper into the teaching realm with me over the summer. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I am an associate professor now, just got tenured and promoted, so it's still new, at Adelphi University in New York. My focus is on intersectional development. That has been my training and my interest, particularly with sexual and religious minority individuals, particularly LGBTQ Muslims. So intersectionality is something that I've worked with a lot in terms of my research, and it's something that I'm very much trying to integrate into the classroom as well. And in that process, I've noticed that there are a lot of barriers in that not everyone on your team or in your department or within the university is speaking the same language about what DEI means. And so the more common ground we could find regarding the values that we hold, I think the easier time we have in creating change and a more welcoming and equitable atmosphere within our classrooms. So that's a big part of what I do, both in terms of my research, my teaching, as well as my consulting work. So I'm going to start with just some basics so that we could all get on the same page regarding definitions and history. A lot of you may have heard the term intersectionality on a taboo list somewhere, things that are too woke to say. But I have to say it's not a new theory. It's been around since the late 1980s. So it's not something new that's entering the scene, but it's something that we are just now really trying to integrate and become responsive to. So the term intersectionality was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, late 1980s, as I mentioned. And essentially, she was a lawyer and she was trying to conceptualize how people can encounter multiple forms of discrimination based on different aspects of their identity. And so she was challenging the use of a single axis framework, that if you're encountering discrimination, it's either racial or it's gender. And she was really trying to revolutionize the legal field to acknowledge that you can encounter multiple forms of discrimination for these multiple identities. And essentially that pressure and that discrimination, the exclusion, is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's not just that you should be prosecuting somebody for gender discrimination and then racial discrimination as two separate categories, but rather recognizing those intersections and the overlap acknowledges the pressure of the intersection within a social framework. And the idea was to look at the intersections and the interrelationships between multiple identities like class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, religion, and then look at these identities within social power structures, and acknowledging that that can vary across contexts. And more than that, intersectionality also acknowledges that you can be both privileged and oppressed simultaneously. And I think sometimes what we get hold up on, and sometimes what my students find to be very challenging, is this idea that you can hold both simultaneously. You could hold power and you could also hold oppression. You could be in a very high economic SES class, and that is a privilege, but you could also be experiencing forms of discrimination due to your race or your gender identity. And the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. The other thing to think about is that it's not a contest. Which one of our students or which one of us has more or less facets that are being discriminated against At the end of the day, in order to create a more equitable world, we want it to be a safer world for all of the identities. And so I think when we enter a space where we acknowledge that identities can be persecuted or they can be ones of power, and those same identities can hold both of those hats depending on where they're situated, becomes a really important message. So within this framework, identity, privilege, and oppression are viewed as being co-constructed and mutually influential and simultaneously interactive. So it's not really like a thread that you could pull and then they all get disentangled. There's not a one-stop shop here where we could address everything with just one little change. It's really recognizing that oppression and power and privilege and change are very much layered structures, and they intersect and cut across multiple forms of society. And academia is a system, it's a powerful system, but it's not within a vacuum, right? As much as many of us would like to say that it's different or we're different or it's in an ivory tower, we're subject to the same challenges and micro and macro stressors and oppressors that the larger social sphere faces as well. And I think that becomes relevant when we consider how politics unfolds on campus, especially in controversial election years. But it's important to remember just across the board, even when it's not as salient, that when there are larger macro stressors within society, larger inequities within society, they play out within our classroom as well. So taking an intersectional approach to our classrooms means that we need to become more aware of the multiple forms of oppression and privilege each individual faces and how they interact with one another. And granted, that's really challenging to do, especially if you're in a large lecture hall of 100 students or you're teaching an online asynchronous course with 50 students. And so to me, the ask isn't something that's out of reach. The ask has to be proportional to your teaching circumstances. But to me, when we think about meeting our students where they're at, a lot of it has to do with being socially informed and viewing our world within a social justice lens and recognizing that the larger social events or hate crimes or school shootings or major controversial legal trials or the Me Too movement are affecting our students within our classroom. So perhaps it's too large of an ask to say that you should have an intense one-on-one, meaningful disclosure conversation with each one of your 100 students in a lecture hall. But I think recognizing the larger social landscape that they walk in and out of every day before they come into your classroom is a big step in getting there and building that rapport and that understanding and empathy. One of my favorite quotes regarding intersectionality is from Lourdes, and it's, "There is no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And I think that comes into play a lot when we consider students, when they're reaching out to us, when they're struggling within the semester. Perhaps it's mental health, perhaps it's meeting deadlines. And sometimes we could think, well, it's just classwork and their boss isn't going to give them a break and there are no accommodations in the real world, so we don't need to do that here either. But I think when we do that, we're really missing the point here, because our classrooms are not a single issue. The assignment is not a single issue. Our students' academic experience is interwoven with their larger experience and their larger identity experience and inequities that they face on a daily basis. And I try to remember that even when a student gives what I would think is a non-plausible excuse or reason for why an assignment is late, I try to remember that perhaps I don't know the whole story. Perhaps there's a larger landscape. And then I try to think about, what does an extension of 24 hours mean to the student? What does it mean to me? Is it really a moment where the floodgates are going to open and all of my students are going to suddenly ask for major extensions? I could tell you from personal experience, I've been in the classroom now almost 20 years. That's not the case. And, you know, I ask students to be accountable and to communicate their needs to me in a timely fashion, because that is a skill that they need for life. But successful self-advocacy is also a really great tool that they get to put in their toolbox. And for them to think, well, I had a roadblock and I was about to stumble, and I advocated, and I was respected, and I was heard, and I got what I needed. That's a tremendous life skill for them to take with them. And so it's a gift that I very willingly give, and I really have not felt that the students have exploited it over the years. So a big part of intersectionality is recognizing all of those identities that are sort of on that checkbox, right? But sometimes we throw around identity terms and we don't know what they mean. And I think part of that is because sometimes these terms are changing and shifting over time, and sometimes they're created in disciplines that are outside of our area of expertise. So, if you're teaching math, you may not have someone who's sitting down and explaining the nuances between race, ethnicity, and culture. So I'm just going to take a pause to do that now. And I acknowledge that there are many different definitions floating around. This is, I would say, the most up to date. It was recently published in American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. So we're just going to break it down together. Race is what is assumed to be a biological or phenotypic group. Phenotypic is usually like external representation of a genetic recipe or profile. So essentially, a lot of people would think about race as the physical signals that you're seeing when you look at somebody. But I think that there are a lot of nuances here, especially with the term assumed and the discussion of biology, very complex. But this is where American psychologists landed. The next idea is ethnicity, which is different than race, and that's the national or tribal origin. And it's certainly possible that you may have diverse matches between race and ethnicity, and that's something to keep in mind as well. And culture are a group of shared practices between a larger group. And so when you look at all those different layers, even just within what we would often consider one larger conglomerate category, what you're seeing is that there's a lot of nuances, a lot of variety and diversity. And something that I always like to make room for is the idea that my students know their experience best, better than I do. And I have colleagues who I've worked with, for decades, who have shared their frustration that when they introduce themselves to people, people assume their race or assume their culture without delving deeper or taking pause to consider that people could identify a color and have a lighter skin tone, or people could live in a certain neighborhood but not practice that particular religion. And I think that all of those discussions and conversations that I've had over the years really open up the window to me to consider that I'm not an expert in someone else's experience. And I think that there are moments where we don't have a lot of reflective thought when we meet people, and our assumptions regarding who they are come into play. But it's to our advantage to take a pause and to consider, without prying, that we may not know everything that there is to know about the person who's standing before us. And that humility helps us engage in more productive ways with others. Which brings me into the classroom. So how do we develop an intersectional pedagogy, and what does that even mean? So intersectional pedagogy examines the experiences of students in a way that moves beyond those single axes. So you're not just seeing a male student, and views them as an intersection of their race, ethnicity, class, ability, gender, and lived experiences, and also makes room for the diversity of those lived experiences. I think a big hot button issue on this is white male students. And as we know, that demographic is declining. There are fewer and fewer white men who are registering for college courses, and fewer men just in general. And I think that when we take a critical lens and we consider what our white male students are experiencing within the classroom, that creates a far richer conversation regarding defensive mechanisms, experiences of threat, a fear of participation, a fear of misstepping. And then it opens up the door to encourage a collaborative allyship, to welcome people to the table, to join together with empathy, to all focus together on equity. And so a big part of creating an intersectional pedagogy for me is encouraging the students to work with me on day one to consider, what does a safe classroom mean? And what does a compassionate classroom mean? And how do we balance our personal interest in authenticity? And sometimes students just feel like, hey, I just want to get it out. In the age of Twitter, it takes just a second to just get it out. But when that expression encroaches on someone else's safety, that's the big question. And so that's why I always encourage a discussion regarding compassionate classrooms more so than safe classrooms, because one person's safety could be another person's lack of safety. And I find that I'm on firmer ground when I talk about empathy and compassion. Intersectional pedagogy also asks educators to understand that identities and experiences compound. As we were discussing, it's greater than the sum of its parts. And we really need to take those identities and experiences into consideration when we develop curricula. And that's, again, a big ask when you're not talking about a subject that's directly related to social context. But in a previous webinar that I did for Hawks, we did talk a little bit about how you can expand your curricula even in fields that you may not think are directly addressing social issues, by highlighting faculty and contributors and researchers of diverse backgrounds, talking about who was invited to the table at various points in history. Even if you're teaching math, you could talk about the numeric systems that were developed, outside of European and Western contexts and why they weren't integrated into our larger mathematics curriculum for some time. So there's a lot that you could do, even if at first blush you think your discipline does not lend itself to those conversations. But what I have found is that students are significantly more receptive and comfortable to those curricula foci if it becomes a part of my discussion with them on the very first day. So when I'm orienting them to how many exams there are going to be and whether it's going to be multiple choice or discussion based, on that same day, I'm also talking to them about why the curriculum has a social justice focus, how it's connected to the larger university's mission of equity and inclusion. I talk about how there are larger interdisciplinary frameworks that are addressing these issues and that it's not just my personal soapbox or political agenda. And I think by putting my work into a larger context of both the university system as well as the larger academic system, that helps students meet me on a place where they feel like, okay, I get where she's coming from and I get what she's trying to do. And I find that students are significantly more receptive when it becomes an intentional part of the curriculum from the beginning. So some of the main ways that you could integrate intersectional pedagogy into your work is to acknowledge students' intersectional identities. You could do that explicitly on the first day. I think it's a good thing to do. There are all sorts of little intersectional identity acknowledgement statements you could find on the internet to put in your online course platform, or you could put it in your syllabus. But I find that that is helpful to make explicit. To also invite students to explore and dialogue about their identities. I know I'm a psychologist, so I have a little bit of an edge here where I actually get to have a whole lesson on cultural psychology, and I invite the students to share with each other their cultural narratives and histories. But I do think it's an important exercise just when we're talking about icebreakers and getting to know you. Students could share 3 funny things they did over winter break, or the name of their fantasy baseball team. They could also share something that's meaningful about themselves too, if we create that opportunity. I also like to include students' cultural and lived experiences in the curricula whenever possible by highlighting diverse researchers, by also making sure that my problem sets are using diverse names and demographics. And then the last part, which could really be a whole webinar unto itself, is about designing online and in-person classrooms for this range of identities and abilities. And again, the more intentional we are about our pedagogy, the more successful we're going to be in creating an inclusive classroom. An inclusive classroom to me is not one where nobody makes a mistake ever. Mistakes are inevitable. We're human. We have implicit biases that we're not always even aware of. So it's really about the intention to do better, to get it right, to take a pause and to think about our students and the world in which they are entering and the ones that they have recently graduated from. And so the more intentional we are, the more that we can grow ourselves as individuals and the more that we can develop our larger relationship with our students and the academic world. Which brings me to this framework of standpoint theory. So standpoint is defined as an awareness of how identities, life histories, and individual differences contribute to self-other awareness and social relations. So it's basically a fancy way of saying, know from whence you come. Which mountaintop are you standing on? Where does your perspective originate from? And the more self-reflection you do, and the more you critically review your own life, the influences within your life, the privileges, as well as the forms of oppression that you have encountered, and most people have encountered both within their lifetime, then the more sensitive you can be to your lens that you're using to view your students and their experiences. So essentially, standpoint theory is really advocating for a greater sense of self-awareness. There are a variety of ways to do it. Obviously, as a psychologist, I'm a big fan of psychology, becoming involved in that endeavor. But there are also exercises that you could find on the internet that help you reflect. And I think that these are good practices for you to integrate for yourself, to have a moment to pause and consider your identities, the ones that you're aware of, the ones that you're least aware of, the ones that were emphasized when you were growing up, the ones that brought you privilege, the ones that were misunderstood. This is part of the LGBTQ safe zone training. It's publicly available. It's also something that I have my students do. I have undergraduate students, I've had doctoral students do this exercise. And what I'm going to say is that the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. But I have never had somebody who completes this exercise and says, I thought about every single question on this list before I got here. So there are all sorts of parts of how we grow and how we develop that come into play that we're not always aware of. And so the more reflective we are, the more compassionate we can be to ourselves, but also to others. This is also another example that I really like about becoming more reflective about your identities. To me, these are what icebreakers should be on the first day of class when everyone's getting to know each other. I think we lose a lot of ground when we have icebreakers that are based on random trivia knowledge or cats dancing on TikTok. I think we gain so much more when we have meaningful points of reflection. This is from the University of Michigan. They have a tremendous amount of diversity resources. They also have a diversity scholars network, which I would really encourage you to join if you do any diversity research or if you identify as a diverse researcher or academic. And so this is, more of a graphical interpretation of where people stand with their identities and the complexity of those identities. So I do think that could also be helpful. This is another exercise where it's more of a checklist, and it's random. It includes all sorts of identities, like being a yogi or being from the West Coast or being an extrovert. So it could be a little bit less triggering if you feel like you're in a more complex landscape of a classroom. that might be a little bit less receptive. And then the idea is to take this checklist and then to look at these questions and to think about how many of you selected more than 5 identities, more than 10 identities, more than 15, which and why. And then to really ask students to consider, what if I told you that you can only select one attribute from the sheet? How would you feel? Could you make that selection? And that really helps students think about the intensity of reducing their peers, their colleagues, even their teachers to one identity, because it's really hard to give any of them up. And so when they're put in that position to reflect on that for themselves, it's far easier to find that compassion for others. These are all different resources that you could use to help students start thinking about it. Other ways that you could integrate intersectionality into the curricula are to ask students to locate themselves. One of the ways that I do that is that I ask the students to select a research article that relates to their community and their identities. And then I ask the students to critically reflect on whether their lived experience is actually represented by the research findings. And then the students are asked to consider whether this disparity is because, hey, maybe I'm an outlier, or maybe it's because of the research design. Maybe the right questions weren't being asked, or maybe the diversity of my community wasn't being recruited. And so they get to think critically about that. And then I empower the students by asking them to redesign the study to be more reflective of their experiential knowledge. And I think, to me, this exercise is one of the ones that I've held on to for quite some time, because it not only teaches the skills of critical thinking in terms of research and research design, but it also creates a meaningful exchange where the students understand, hey, why am I in this research methods class? Because, in my class of, 25 research methods students, I would say the vast majority of them are not saying, I want to be a researcher when I leave here. They're taking it as a requirement for the psych major. But I think by the time they finish these types of assignments, they are more likely to see the relevance and the connection to their own lives. So we're rounding out, and I see we have a bunch of questions, and I'll get to them in the end. And so the other idea I want to talk about is how an intersectional classroom is really a co-created space. I talked a little bit about that in terms of on that very first day, being intentional and being transparent. But it becomes really something that you have to critically consider on a daily basis. It's not something you could put on your syllabus and have on that first day and then walk away from and say, I've done my work. But it's a lot of work each class to create an environment where everyone feels safe, supported, and encouraged to express their views. And that's always a little bit rocky. What happens when you have students who actually have the wrong answer? What do you say? How do you create a warm, fuzzy environment if the student is wrong, or if the student says something that's offensive or that is, racist? What do you do then? And so I acknowledge the question. And what I'm going to say is that that's a much larger conversation to have, both together, but also within the larger framework of your university. And I'm a big fan of having policies and trainings in place before these events occur, because in the moment, it's really difficult to navigate well and safely. The other idea within the classroom is to make sure that the content is viewed from multiple perspectives. I try to have multiple perspective assignments where I specifically introduce a debate to students, or I ask them to debate an issue, to become familiar with this idea of, hey, I have my standpoint, I have my perspective. There may not be an objective truth here. And that's why we have debates, and that's how we have growth. And that's a tough sell, I'm going to say, in first year classes like general psychology, where I'm getting students right out of high school, where they've also often have learned that there's one correct answer. And so to break that up for them and to introduce, 4 different theories of language development could sometimes be mind-boggling to them. Well, then which one is right? And then, my answer is, well, they could all be right, or they could be right in different contexts. And humanity is really diverse and varied. So there is not one theory of language development. There are 4, and probably in 20 years from now, there will be 6. And that's a big leap. And so to have those moments where they're expanding their critical thought and their ability to digest multiple perspectives within the course content, I think also gets those neurons and those neurological highways open for them to consider how there could be diversity of thought and experience in their social worlds as well. And having an intersectional classroom really helps students understand individuals' experiences, values, and perspectives, and how all of that influences how they construct knowledge in any field or discipline. And again, that's to me like the real crux of critical thinking that has to happen at the college level, is to have people expand their expectation regarding objectivity, expand their expectation that their perspective is the correct perspective, and opening themselves up to multiplicity of thought, but also multiplicity of experience. And I think that oftentimes that's a component that's not intentionally integrated into our curriculum when we're trying to just meet the benchmarks to get them to the next course or the next advanced course. All right, so that's all that I have for you, but I see that there are a lot of questions.
Yep, we do. So one question we have is, how can this be done in states where DEI is illegal or where students can report a professor for talking about offensive topics?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, especially if you're in a state or publicly funded university as opposed to a private university. I think that is a real question, especially in states where we're seeing the reduction of tenure. You may also be in a position where you don't have the privilege of tenure. And I think that does come up a lot. So to me, I think grounding that we could all agree on is that within most disciplines, if not all, there are multiple perspectives. And I think starting from an objective space of just training people to cognitively consider debates, multiplicity of perspectives, that debates don't often or always have a conclusion, that there are multiple perspectives. I think that could be an entryway that is not laden with a lot of controversial or taboo words, right? But I think other things become important. So talking about the history of your profession is an objective fact, right? So who are the people who created these theories? Showing pictures of those people, letting people reflect on who is missing in the room. It's an exercise that I like doing with my advanced doctoral students, where I ask them to consider who is not in our room today. And thinking about the absence of people is as powerful as thinking about who is there as well.
Thank you. As a follow-up to that one, how can one avoid addressing DEI issues when one is teaching sociology, in which DEI is central to the subject matter?
So I would agree. I would say it is central. I don't think it should be avoided. But again, if you're living in a state that's hostile to these conversations, I think sometimes that hostility is, matched to certain trigger words. And so I think that thoughts are larger than specific terminology. And so I would encourage people to consider critical thinking thoughts, questions, points of reflection without necessarily going into those taboo words. But I also think it's really an opportunity for chairs to step up and to create change. And in my consulting work, I have met some very, very brave administrators who are in states where there is shifting legislation regarding issues of diversity. And they have objectively stated, hey, if you want me to be chair, if you want me to be leading this ship, then we need to make sure that every student is getting a fair shake. And this is how I'm doing it. You don't like it? Challenge me. And you'd actually be quite surprised. Administrators, higher up than chairs often are just like, hey, keep your own house in order. I'm not going to go down into the nitty gritties. But I do think that faculty who are not unionized, faculty who are in vulnerable positions based on their own identities, faculty who do not have tenure or who are not in line for tenure, all of those faculty are quite vulnerable. So I think it really lands on the administration the chairs as well as the advanced administration to take a stand, because I'm not going to tell somebody to give up their job security in today's economy. So I think that these are really tough questions to ask.
Thank you. How is intersectionality different from simply saying that we contain multitudes and that we as educators need to be aware, sensitive, and respectful, which is obviously something we should all be?
I think they're probably very similar. I would say that the big difference is that intersectionality is linked specifically to identity categories, which are then situated within power structures. So it's, I would say, a more developed version of saying we all exist with multitudes, because multitudes is like a little bit wavy. What are multitudes? How do you pin them down? Intersectionality had to be really specific in terms of a theory because it went into our judicial system. And so when you have legislation that's integrating a concept, it has to be really pinned down in concrete terms. And that's why you saw sort of a boon of intellectual thought around intersectionality. But I do think that a variety of fields had similar conversations for quite some time. Anthropology, sociology, social work, psychology was much later to the table on that. So I wouldn't say it's like per se absolutely revolutionary, brand new concept. I mean, even intersectionality has been around since the 80s. But I would say it was one of the more developed versions of this conversation.
Thank you. So some students will not want to share their identities and or their culture, lived experiences. Thus, how can one create an inclusive classroom in which silence must be considered and respected?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. When I do teach about creating rapport with participants, I always highlight the necessity of silence and respecting silence. And when I do those cultural reflection exercises, I don't require that we go around and around robin and everyone shares. There's never like a mandatory sharing in a larger classroom setting. I also ask that when students exit from, a dyad where they've had these types of discussions, that they each ask consent from one another regarding what was shared and what can be shared outside of that dyad. And even within the dyad, I always say, on the sheet, only share that which you're comfortable with. And I usually put in what I would say is sort of like low-hanging fruit questions as well, so that if that's what someone wants to focus on, they can. So with undergraduates, I usually have a question like, what's your favorite cultural food, or is there a cultural celebration that you would like to talk about? And it's a common ground because most cultures celebrate things, and most cultures celebrate things with food. And so it's an easy way for students to talk about things. And sometimes, I have students who say, well, I identify as an American. I don't really have a culture, but I love a good barbecue. And then they could have a nice conversation about what barbecues are, why they've become an American pastime, and how, the origins of barbecues are quite ancient. So I try to leave some low-hanging fruit questions as well.
Thank you. There's a comment/question. They're curious about why intersectionality refers to identity so much, and for example, the sociological realities of master, ascribed, and achieved statuses. They ask because people are resistant to intersectionalities, and they may be particularly resistant to the concept of identity if identity is believed to be a choice. Statuses, especially master statuses, may not have the connotation of identity.
So I think it's a good question. I remember back in the day when I was working on my dissertation, my advisor said, well, are you going to use the term sexual minority identity, or are you going to use the term sexual orientation? And it became like a conversation that we had to explicitly have and really think about. And this was some time ago. And, she had particular views, and I wanted to graduate the program. But I think that, I think those debates between behaviors and identity and orientation and what you do, I think you're right. I think that there are still some people who think that gender identity or sexual identity is a choice. And I don't think that you're going to be able to change those views most times in a public debate in a classroom. And usually that's not my intention. I'm not there to proselytize or to shame students in a large forum. I think those conversations are best had one-on-one, with individual students during office hours. And I do have a note on my syllabus where I say some topics are quite complex and can't be fully addressed within our classroom. And I will ask if we could continue those conversations together during office hours. And so it's there, it's in the syllabus. It's something that I talk about again on that first day, trying to frame expectations so that we're all on the same page about what could unfold within a prescribed space. And there are larger things to consider as well, which is, the issue of shaming students who have diverse views and creating space for debate and consideration, but also acknowledging the harm that could happen if you have those debates within a classroom, right? So if you're debating whether sexual identity is an identity or it's an orientation or it's a choice, and you have a sexual minority person in your classroom, that's a really painful experience for that student. So when I try to make the determination of which conversations have to happen during my office hours and which can happen within my classroom, it's really about balancing harm, right? So what was the larger harm of the comment that was said in that moment? What's the larger harm of students thinking I'm not addressing it? And what's, the very real tangible harm of bystander trauma, as well as the students themselves who feel like they're targeted by that conversation. And so those are all things that I try to weigh in the moment.
Thank you so much. How much trust and relationship building needs to happen before we begin to ask students to share about their identities? Is this something that should be done on the first day?
So I traditionally do this about like 3 to 4 classes in, because I like giving people time to build rapport. I think that, even independent of identities, students don't always feel comfortable in a large classroom setting. And so that's why those are always dyad conversations. I don't have it be like a group of 4 or even with the whole class with a big disclosure. I always have them pair off. Traditionally, people tend to sit next to someone who they feel comfortable with. And so that's always something that's sort of in place already. But I always make the announcement, if you want to get up and switch and change your seat and move around, get to know somebody else, you certainly can. So creating opportunities for people to self-protect if they feel like that's necessary, that becomes important too. I think you can do it in a smaller version on a first day. Something that I like doing is, what's the history of your name? And that's like a really low hanging fruit, like, how did your parents pick your name? And sometimes that relates to culture and history and family lore. And sometimes, it relates to really funny things. Like I had a student who was named after like her dad's like favorite baseball team. I had another student who was named after her parents, romantic getaway in Paris, right? There's a large variety of responses. They're not all going to be meaningful in a cultural identity sense. But there's enough sharing that happens that it lets the students know that this is a value that I hold.
Thank you so much. Another question we have, how do you navigate through a political environment in which students are indoctrinated by families, religious leaders, media, and peer groups into inclusive groups from childhood that reject intersectionality?
Great question. I'm going to say it's bigger than I could, adjust in the next 15 minutes. That really is, a question that deserves a very long training. But in brief, what I'm going to say is, I don't try to change people overnight. I look at education as a learning process that happens in increments over time. I also think about the basic building blocks that have to be in play before you can ask people to change larger worldviews. And so some of those basic building blocks are critical thinking, multiplicity of perspectives, humility, self-location. And so once those building blocks are in play, then you could have those higher order conversations regarding complex thoughts, worldview, and creating change. And again, in psychology, I have a little bit of an easier time because there are a whole lot of segues. When we do talk about identity, there's a category of foreclosure, which unfortunately they're all familiar with now, given our economic realities. But we talk about it in terms of identity, how sometimes there are cultural pressures and people choose an identity before it fully solidifies them. So if your parents have a political affiliation, and they want you to have that political affiliation, you might become a young Republican or a young Democrat, and have that political identity mapped out for you by the time you're 15. But is that really where you would want to land as you develop as an adult? And I try to make that a balanced conversation. I even show a clip from Blackish, which is really good, and they talk about sort of the family's horror that their child wants to be a young Republican and the family's Democrat, and they've always been Democrat. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? Because I think that these debates are not, one-sided issues. It's not as if, people from liberal families don't foreclose on identity and political issues as well. And so I try to create a landscape that is as honest as possible about the diversity and the commonalities of human experience, to create a space for safe self-reflection. Again, that's not, smacking of a threat or of an agenda, other than let's think about our world in a more complex way.
Thank you. We have a participant looking for a few suggestions on specific course policies related to exams, work assignments, attendance with intersectionality in mind.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, I actually had a little note at the bottom of my signature that said, that I honor students' needs to care for themselves and for others. And if there are time-sensitive assignments or emails, I'll, have that be explicit. Eventually, I actually had to delete that note just because we weren't allowed that many characters in our signature. But I think a note like that on the syllabus can be really powerful as well, acknowledging the need to care for both the self and for others. I tend to have a syllabus policy on extensions that is a little bit more firm than what could be negotiated in person, just so that students recognize that it is an ask and it is a negotiation. So I'll read the policy and then I will say orally, this is not set in stone. If you encounter a difficulty, be sure to let me know. Let me know within, an advanced amount of time. With online asynchronous courses, I always let the students know you have to let me know if you're, by 5 p.m. at the end of business day, because I can't create an accommodation at 11:30 p.m. or 1 a.m., right? That's not a reasonable ask. So I try to help the students think about the relationship that's in play, and the importance of self-advocacy, but also self-advocacy within a social structure and social norm that recognizes that their faculty are people too, and also recognizes the idea of equity. And so I spend time explaining to students what the difference is between equity and equality. And that seems to help students be more self-accountable, also accountable to the larger fairness of what we need within the classroom, and more respectful in terms of what it is that they're asking for.
Thank you. We have a question/comment asking if anybody has read Thomas Sowell's Preferential Policies in an International Perspective. From what they've observed, they think that the introduction of intersectionality in the classroom has already led to some negative unintended consequences predicted by Thomas Sowell's work. In particular, students of all backgrounds who previously worked well together now form their own in-groups, which are hostile to be perceived out-groups. I do not believe that this is the result that was intended That wasn't the intended goal for adding intersectionality to the classroom, or the goal of federal title, I think that's 9 policies under which public universities operate.
So I think it's a great question. I think you're also getting to a core social psychology discussion regarding in-groups and out-groups. And what they have found is that when people self-categorize into specific groups and then they are in competition with each other for limited resources, that is when you find them not collaborating. But when you have people who are in different groups, but who are collaborating in order to achieve a shared goal, then you actually see greater forms of interaction and positive rapport, humanization. So having diverse groups for group work that are all gearing towards a shared goal has been very helpful. Other things to consider are also having a larger identity. So social psychology has found that even when people have different or diverse sort of sub-identities, if they have a larger identity that they all can find grounding in, then that helps build rapport too. So sometimes, with some campuses, people like love the football team and everybody's a Panther, everybody's a Tiger. And that could be that larger macro identity that brings people together. And perhaps I'm just an idealist, but I like to share with students the macro identity of being a human. Yes, sometimes it can backfire. I actually once had a student who, wrote in my review that in not such a nice way that I was a humanist. And, my dean was like, oh, this is a really weird review. And I was like, you know what? I wear that badge with honor. I'm a humanist. I think everybody deserves a fair shake and we got to meet everybody where they're at. And, that's okay. So I think you're always going to encounter some resistance and some tension. But I think when we focus on our larger commonalities of value, that's when you start seeing those barriers break down.
Thank you so much. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
That's it. It was a real pleasure. I love the questions. They always make me pause and think about things in more developed ways. So thank you for collaborating with me on that. And thank you everyone for attending. It was really humbling to see so many of you here today.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you all for attending today. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it becomes available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat right now so it's easier access. These free webinars are brought to you by Hawks Learning, an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit hawkslearning.com, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you all for attending.